Okay, back to Psalm 82, folks.
All right.
What we notice in this psalm, for one thing, is the striking threefold use of the term Elohim. And it's used for God himself, it's used for the angels, and then finally it's used for human beings. And the scene is thoroughly judicial. It involves the heavenly court. And the heavenly court is, in fact, dealing with a problem that concerns a judicial process down on earth where men are engaged in judgment and failing to do so properly. And so God is taking account of that. His eyes go to and fro through the world to see where there are problems that need judicial attention, and then he meets with the divine council, and they determine upon measures to deal with that. And so the psalm begins with the word Elohim, and in the first sense of God, capital G. And it tells us then the Elohim Nitzav Ba'adat El. So Elohim, God, capital G, now takes his position in now you have the construct form of Adat in the council chamber. This is what we're talking about now, the heavenly council. Here's a term that describes that. In the council of El, which again, I guess, then is referring to God himself. So God now rises up in the midst of the judicial scene, in the midst of his own heavenly divine court, which then is described in the poetic parallelism of the psalm here. This heavenly court is further described as B'kerev Elohim, and the verb now is yishpot. So God Nitzav, he stands up, and yishpot, he enters into the judicial process, he executes judgment. But the heavenly council, which has been called then the Adat El, the council of God, is also said to be B'kerev Elohim. And now God does not stand in the midst of himself, but he stands in the midst of the Elohim. And so clearly here, and within one verse, we have Elohim used first, capital G, but then secondly for the angels, the heavenly hosts who are the members of the court, the members of the council. So he rises in the midst of the council, that is, in the midst of the council members who are the Elohim folk. And this then is part of the argument that I make, that you repeatedly hear that of all the creatures, man is the only one, the image of God. That's simply not true. The angels are also made in the image of God. They have an Elohim likeness, which here comes out, and they're actually being designated as Elohim. And speaking up now, God says, and now he has reference to something that's going on earth. So God and the Elohim angels up there are addressing themselves to a situation on earth. And what God says as he looks at that is, Ad matai tishbatu avel. Now he is entering into judgment, but he has appointed on earth those who are his representatives to administer the divine imperium on earth. And so they are engaged in judgment, but guilty of malfeasance of office of here. And so God says to them, how long tishbatu avel, which can be taken in one of two ways, either abstractly, avel meaning evil, how long will you render evil judgments, or it can be taken more concretely and personally for the evil man. And if the latter, which the parallel clause then favors, the thought of tishbatu would be, how long do you render judgments in behalf of the wicked? And in parallelism, then it goes on to say, Upanei Rishaim, and the face of the wicked tisa'u, you lift up. To lift up, as a judge, to lift up the face of the wicked is to pronounce a favorable verdict for the wicked. And you shouldn't be doing this, obviously, for the wicked. You should be doing it for the righteous. And so how long, God challenges these earthly judges? Are you going to continue them defending the evil man? How long are you going to be rendering favorable judgments, lifting up the face of the wicked? What you should be doing positively then is verse 3 brings up what you should be doing is rendering judgment. Again, the same verb shaphat. You should be rendering judgment in behalf of Dal as the weak, and Yathom, the fatherless. They're the ones that need your judicial protection. Yes, and then again, in the parallelism, all of these verses have this good illustrations of synonymous parallelism. In parallel with Shifatu, you have Hasdiku to give a favorable verdict to vindicate, to justify. So you should judge the poor and the fatherless. Yes, the afflicted and the oppressed are the ones whom you should be, whose cause you should be vindicating. And then verse 4 continues this description of the positive duties of the earthly judge when it tells him, deliver, provide escape for the weak and the Evyon and the needy, because they are being oppressed, and so provide escape for them, yes, from the hand of the Rishaim, from the power of the wicked, Hatzilu, from the verb natsal, Hifil, deliver them. So that's what they should be doing. And then returning to the indictment again, that was already in verse 2, verse 5 says, they do not know, they do not understand. In darkness, yet halaku, they are walking about. And that verb is interesting. The hithpa'el of the verb halak is used to describe sort of the conduct of an earthly judge. You use, for example, of Samuel making his judicial circuit and so on. And used in a couple of striking ways. For example, it's used of Enoch and of Noah, who are prophet figures, which ties in with our subject, and to describe the fact that they have contact with God and the heavenly council. But here are some earthly judges now who are said to be walking about in darkness, and as a result then of their not practicing their office faithfully with knowledge and understanding, and the judicial office being established on earth to stabilize the whole societal order. When it fails, well, the whole order of life on earth is tottering, and so it concludes, and all the very foundations of the earth are tottering because of the failure of a proper judicial order in the world. Now then, in verse 6, recognizing the proper dignity of these earthly appointees of heaven. Yes, God is the one who set them up and authorized them to engage in this godlike function of judging. That is what an Elohim creature is, for one thing. One who is godlike as a exercising dominion and judgment. And recalling that, verse 6, then God says, I said, Elohim atem. So here's the word Elohim again, this time not referring to God himself, obviously. He's saying this to someone else. Nor is it referring to the Elohim angels mentioned up there in verse 1. They are part of the divine council, but here we are looking to the earth and something that's going on down here. Clearly these Elohim are earthly beings. They're human beings. These are men, as the rest of the verse and Jesus' citation of it in the Gospel of John makes clear to us. So I said, you are gods, and then in parallelism with Elohim, B'nai Elyon, you are sons of the Most High of Elyon, Kulakem, all of you. So these earthly judges to whom the word of God comes and who have this godlike dignity, they are described as Elohim creatures. And where is the verse in in John as well, where Jesus cites this language and definitely tells us that it was intended to be applied to human beings. So here then is the third use of Elohim, and with a third meaning. And verse 7 now confronts these earthly folk who had been dignified with the very term Elohim, and who had let it go to their head. So here we come back to a very conspicuous theme in the early chapters of Genesis, where the setting up of human kingship is a prominent theme, but even more prominent seems to be the abuse of the office in the line of Cain and the line of Lamech, the sons of the sons of the gods. So the Genesis 6 passage about the B'nai Elohim, I would tie in with this kind of language of Elohim that refers to earthly judges, their earthly kings and so on, who are defying the ordinances of God as to the family and the state, and who, worst of all, are taking their designation as Elohim creatures in a way that was never intended, because they are naming themselves the sons of the gods to bring out the claim that they are superior to God, capital G, himself, in terms of rendering judgment. I can avenge myself 77-fold if Yahweh can avenge sevenfold. So there is this motif of the ideology of divine kingship there in those early chapters of Genesis, which leads where? Well, what's the upshot of that whole story? The flood, So these early great Elohim creatures who perverted their proper Elohim character into an improper, idolatrous, blasphemous one of ascribing deity beyond the Creator to themselves, that brought about their ultimate fall and judgment in the flood. And I take it that we could have some echoes or allusions to that in what God now says to these judges in view in Psalm 82. He says, in spite of your dignity, and really you are the ministers of God, you are Elohim creatures by my appointment, nevertheless, Ki Adam, like man, like Adam himself, and like any other fallen son of Adam, you're just mortal. You are not immortal creatures in spite of this judicial dignity imparted to you. You are going to die like any other man. And then it says, yes, like any one of the Sarim, the princes, you too will fall. And I find it difficult to escape from seeing, like, again, that context back there in the early chapters of Genesis leading up to the flood, especially in my interpretation of the the sons of God in the 6th chapter as being princes in the earth, the kings in the earth, in whose courts there were brought forth the Nephilim, the Gibborim, whom I interpret to be precisely what is said here, Sarim, princes. So there seems to be an illusion. The outcome of those Genesis 6 tyrants, those Lamech-like characters, was the judgment of God, and they died, they fell, and God's judgment will catch up with these later ones who are in view here in Psalm 82 as well. And so the psalm then closes, returning full circle as the psalmist then expresses the prayer that because of the failure of these human kings, that the God, the judge of heaven and earth, would enter into the picture and do things right. That he would come and he would not speak a word in favor of the wicked, but that he would speak a word of deliverance for the poor and the needy and so on. And so the prayer goes up, rise up Elohim, as I say, full circle. This last use of Elohim corresponds to the first one, capital G, the prayer to God. Rise up, O God, yes, and enter into judgment with the earth, and it's viewed as a universal cosmic judgment for it says, for you inherit all the earth, or the whole earth is your inheritance. It is for you to dispose of and to judge. So here we have another excellent and full biblical unveiling of the heavenly scene as one which at the heart of it is a courtroom, and with the angelic beings as the members of the divine council. Well, finishing our discussion then of this general theme of the heavenly council, of course there are other passages that could be dealt with, and Daniel 7 would be one, the vision of the Son of Man up there on before the throne of the Ancient of Days, and so on, with all of the angels in that setting. Passages like Revelation 4 and 5, or in the book of Revelation, where the Lamb of God is seen, and picking up on that business in Zechariah 6 that we were talking about, is the Lamb, the Messiah, as the priest king, who is a priest by the throne of God, and the intimacy of the enthronement of the Lamb, the king by the throne of God, comes out even more in Romans 4 and 5, where the Lamb stands in the very midst of the throne of God, and of course the encircling hosts of the various kinds of angels that are mentioned there. So here and there the Bible does open up for what otherwise is not open to your vision and mine, the heavenly scene, and wherever it does, it's a picture we get of the divine council, the involvement of God's angels about the throne of God. Well, this is where the prophets had to be caught up if they were to be true prophets. And in this respect, Moses was the prime example. The other prophets had to have this too, as we'll be noticing. But it is especially then in the case of Moses that he is the one who, par excellence, has this intimate face-to-face kind of relationship to the Lord, and is then sent back with his ministry to men. For this, to make this point now of the way in which Moses and the prophets like unto Moses had entree into the divine council, we want to turn now to Numbers 12, again in our Hebrew Bibles, which speaks about Moses and his especially full and intimate fellowship with God, and yet in connection with which there is a statement that the other prophets have similar experiences. So we're going to be turning to Numbers 12, and we'll be focusing especially on verses 6 through 8. I deal with this in, if you want to look it up, in Images of the Spirit, pages 64 and 65 and following there. Which I introduce by saying of Moses. Moses was prototypal of Christ in respect to his endowment with the image of the glory spirit. Moses enjoyed as a continuing privilege access to the glory presence and to the creative encounter in the presence, which we have seen, and we'll come back to this, was productive of a glory likeness in the prophets. Moreover, the revelatory experience granted to Moses was more intimate than that of the other prophets, as the Lord himself affirms in the statement related in Numbers 12, verses 6 through 8. When God raised up prophets, this will be a pre-summary and we'll return for the details. When God raised up the prophets, they experienced the divine self-disclosure in a more visionary state. It was otherwise with Moses, whose station was above all the other prophets and all the other servants in God's Old Testament house. He entered within the cloud veil in a normal not ecstatic or dreamlike state. And there, in a normal sort of psychological or frame of mind, he spoke with the Lord, as it's said here, mouth to mouth, or as it's expressed in Exodus 33, face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. So that's the point we are wanting to make, and to see something of the details of the exegesis of that passage then in Numbers 12. Now, another preliminary thing that I do in preparing to discuss this passage, and also the preceding chapter, in Numbers 11, this whole context we're going to be dealing with. Numbers 12 is the one then that expounds this intimate presence of God with Moses. Chapter 11, just before we come to the 12th, is the one where Moses is distributing the Spirit of God to the 70 elders, that particular episode. And in dealing, I guess that's with that one, that I bring up the question of just when and where all of this is happening. In Numbers 11, the question arises as to who are these 70 elders, and for what function is Moses now taking of the Spirit which is upon him and distributing it to them. Numbers 11 itself doesn't indicate what their particular function is to be. And in Images of the Spirit, if I can find the place here, it gets into that question and presents the thesis that what is going on in Numbers, well, really 10, 11, 12, that whole thing, is in terms of chronology and time, one and the same as what has been described back in Exodus 18, or rather I should put it the other way around. As you work through the book of Exodus, and you come up to chapter 19 and following, you're at Sinai, and the making of the covenant, and so on through the rest of the book. And by the time you come to chapter 40, you've had the account then of the setting up of the tabernacle and the anointing of the tabernacle. And then you move on in Leviticus and Numbers, and the setting now, it's a year after they have come to Sinai. It's 1 year later. And now the line of march has been all set up according to God's appointment, and they're on their way journeying up to Canaan. But it's a year later then when we are dealing with Numbers 10 and following, including the 11th chapter, as I said, which has the anointing of these elders, and the 12th chapter, which has this word of God about the special privileged position of Moses. And when we come to the 12th chapter, right away in the opening verses, we read about a problem that is connected with the complaints of Aaron and Miriam against Moses with respect to this Cushite woman whom Moses has married. So if we get in chapter 12 some references to the wife of Moses. And we are wondering what this is all about, and how she relates to what we have last read about back in chapter 18 of Exodus, and of course earlier on in the book of Exodus, where Moses has married Zipporah and he has the 2 children and so on. And chapter 18 describes a situation. Now they've come to Sinai, but before the story unfolds of what happened at Sinai, the covenant and all, we find ourselves reading about the personal life of Moses and about Jethro, his father-in-law, and Zipporah, the wife, and so on. They all come, and various things are described there, including the problem that Jethro spots in the way in which Moses is overburdened with all the judicial cases of the people. And so Jethro's advice is that he should appoint to rule over the various units, the thousands, the hundreds, the fifties, and so on of Israel. Other subordinate officials, 70 subordinate judges to handle and only the more difficult cases then would be handled by Moses. Now my contention is that although in the arrangement of the book of Exodus, 18 falls here before the account of the covenant making at Sinai, that this is another of those instances of dyschronologized narrative where the narrative is structured thematically rather than just strictly chronological. And so the thought is, and the thesis I present in the final chapter of the structure of biblical authority is that we keep getting farther and farther from the point here of bringing in other things, but it can't help it. My thesis about the book of Exodus is that it, like the Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are covenant witness documents. Their essential nature and purpose and function is to be the Spirit's documentary testimony to the fact that God has made covenant. The old covenant in one case and the new covenant in the other, and so the New Testament Gospels are the Spirit's documentary witness to the church, underscoring the fact that in the blood of the cross, the blood of the covenant, God has already instituted and ratified the new covenant. And so the structure of a gospel is that it's the second part of it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's the passion narrative. The account of Christ's death is the account of the covenant institutions. And what about the first half of the Gospels? Well, they are the things that set forth the life of the covenant mediator. His wonderful acts, his teaching, and so on. And so when my suggestion is that Exodus is the Gospel of Moses, and corresponding to the passion narratives in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the second half of them is 19 through 40, because that's exactly what the last half of the book of Exodus is about: the making of the covenant ceremony, the provision of the documents, the two tables of the covenant, and then after the breaking of the covenant, the reestablishing of the covenant, and finally the final confirmation in the 40th chapter is the taking up residence of the Lord on the throne. In other words, the replication of the divine heavenly council in the tent of meeting here on earth, with the final confirmation of the covenant. So that's in Exodus chapters 19 through 40, which leaves the first 18 chapters as being very much as the first half of the Gospels are. Moses there, Jesus here, the covenant mediators, 1 through 18 being the account of nature and the more personal elements perhaps in the life of the covenant mediator, including his family. And so here, before we leave that section and move into the next, even though it involves jumping ahead a whole year, because it wasn't until after they were there for a year that Jethro and Zipporah actually joined them. But nevertheless, chapter 18 already records that, because it's doing things thematically. It's dealing with this theme before it picks up this particular theme. Now, that's what I take to be, and the proof of it is that Moses himself virtually tells us this when he rehearses this history in Deuteronomy 1. So you turn to Deuteronomy 1, where he's going through all of this, and these two episodes are connected. The complaint that Moses makes in this setting in Numbers, that he is too overburdened with his judicial responsibilities, introduces Moses' rehearsal of the history of 18. He connects them by using the complaint of Numbers 11, and then the response of God is given in terms of the provision of the 70 elders, which is mentioned back in chapter 18. That got somewhat blurred in the delivery there. Get hold of structure of biblical authority, and then the last chapters set that out for us. So what this amounts to then is that questions that arise when you come to Numbers 12 about who is this Cushite woman and so on, and what is her relationship to Zipporah, and speculations now that Zipporah was out of the picture and this is some second wife are all beside the point. They are all just failures to recognize that it's one and the same episode that is in view here. So it's a case, as we say, of dyschronologized narrative. It's a question of thematic interests overriding strictly chronological concerns. This comes out in enough in the book. So let's now then turn with that much background and to Numbers 12 and see how in the opening verses this problem of the additional or the supposedly additional wife emerges. And although verses 4 through 6 are the ones we're primarily concerned with, we'll start with the beginning of that chapter. All right, Numbers 12. Vatidaber Miriam Haron. So here's the sister and the brother of Moses, and together they are involved in some complaining about brother Moses. And so Miriam and Aaron spoke Bimosha against Moses, and their particular complaint had to do with Al-Odot, upon the causes of what they complained about, had respect to Al-Odot, Ha-Isha Ha-Kushit, about the Cushite wife, or woman, or wife, whom he had, lakak, of course, is the verb that is used to take a wife, whom he had married. For a Cushite wife, in fact, he had taken. Now then, this is, as I said, is where the question arises. Who is the Cushite wife mentioned in Numbers 12? We had heard about Zipporah before, but who is this one? Now the situation is then that for a year here at Sinai, Aaron and Miriam have had brother Moses pretty much to themselves. When Moses came at God's call into Egypt to deliver the people there was the episode where he had left behind Zipporah and the children. She hasn't been there. And so for a year, Zipporah, his wife, has not been around. And as I say, Miriam and Aaron pretty much have had him to themselves, and they've had certain privileges, and they are now concerned to be jealous about that. But what has happened now is that out of the past, what Exodus 18 describes has just happened here as part of the background of Numbers 10, 11, and 12. And in fact, in these chapters, we begin to have references again to Moses' father-in-law, and that's the same sort of people who were involved in the Exodus 18 thing. His relatives, his in-laws, are now mentioned again in this context. So here, Zipporah, his wife, Moses' wife, comes back on the scene, and we can only speculate as to the family squabbling about privilege and honor and so on. The way it's expressed here is that they said, verse 2, Miriam and Aaron said, "Is it only indeed by Moses that the Lord has spoken? Is it not also by us that he has spoken? And the Lord heard. Now, what one gathers from that is that apparently Moses' wife, and from the area from which Zipporah came, could well qualify her to be described as a Cushite woman. And so here comes Zipporah, this Cushite wife of Moses, and apparently now she is making insistent claims on the special privilege of her husband, and brother and sister Miriam and Aaron take it amiss, and they want to assert that it isn't only Moses whom this Zipporah is bragging about all the time, but they too have been privileged. As they say, is it only by Moses? Is it not also by us that the Lord has spoken? So this sort of a quarrel comes up within the family, where they take affront at Moses and complain about him, and the Lord hears what's going on, and so he speaks. And so verse 3 now says, parenthetically, why was it that the Lord had to take? Why didn't Moses speak up and deal with this himself? And here we get that remarkable statement, one that figured in early on in discussions of the documentary hypothesis as one of the so-called details in the text that couldn't be Mosaic, because to say what is said here by Moses would not himself would not seem to be appropriate. What it says here is that the man Moses was humble exceedingly above any other man who was upon the face of the earth. So this is the sort of thing where you say, I excel in humility, with a statement which seems to contradict what you're saying. And and Moses allegedly couldn't have said that. But no, as a matter of fact, yes, Moses could. A perfectly objective view of the situation, that he could say this. And as a matter of fact, I like this as, Moses is like unto Christ in a special way, each one mediator of the whole house of God in terms of their outward authority and office. But this passage brings out there's a sort of inner spiritual subjective likeness of Moses to the Lord of Philippians 2, who though in the very likeness of who being God, and nevertheless is not jealous to be grasping after his divine prerogatives, but humbles himself unto the death of the cross. It's the humble mind of the Savior that is already expressed in the attitude of Moses, each one with the ultimate authority over the house of God, and yet Moses not asserting himself, ready to let the Lord be his defender against false accusations. And so I think that's what verse 3 is saying, and it's a very clear understanding of the authoritative status of Moses, and at the same time that is not pushing his authority to defend himself. But because he did not do it, the Lord, his defender, does proceed to defend him. And so verse 4 tells us then that the Lord spoke up pitom, suddenly, in the absence of a self-defense by Moses. The Lord abruptly, suddenly interposes with judgment. And the Lord spoke up suddenly unto Moses and unto Aaron and unto Miriam. What he said to them there, you get the command, Se'u, come forth now. So there is a summons issued to appear before their judgment seat. Come forth, the three of you. Come forth unto the proper place of judgment, heaven on earth. The divine counsel come down to earth. Where does it come down to earth? It comes down from the heavenly council meeting place to the Har Moed, the earthly meeting place of the divine council. Come unto the Har Moed, a corresponding symbol for the heavenly Moed, the council place, the place of assembly, is the Har Moed. What is the Har Moed? It's the mount of assembly. The tent of meeting, the Har Moed, is an earthly replica of heaven. The Har Moed, the mount of assembly, is another biblical image to depict the reality of the heavenly council. In each case, it's heaven itself, the divine council scene. And so come forth, the three of you, to the place of judgment, not the heavenly one itself, but to the earth, the replication of it. And they did. They went forth, the three of them. And then the Lord appeared. This is heaven on earth, and so the Lord of heaven now descends and takes up his place there, identifying it as the counterpart to the heavenly reality. And so the Lord descended, Ba'amud Anan. Now, the Amud you recognize is from the verb Amad, to stand. Amud is the standing thing in terms of an anthropomorphism here. It's the feet of God, the pillars, the standing things, as God, as Psalm 82 said, Nitzat. God takes his stand at the place of judgment to begin to execute judgment. So here God comes to earth with the two pillars representing the feet of God, taking his stand there. The two pillars, which are the theophanic glories, spirit phenomenon, as we said, the equivalent of heaven itself. And the cloud formation, which also, of course, is descriptive of the heavens, like Daniel 7, the Son of Man appeared in the clouds of heaven. So here's the glory spirit theophany takes place. And thus now the Amud, the pillar, the feet, the standing things, they have the verb itself. They stood there. What else would you expect? And so the feet, the standing things, took their stand there at the entrance to the tent. And God then summoned Aaron and Miriam, and the two of them now stepped forth before the presence of the Lord. And it's at this point then that we have this statement of the Lord with respect to the special dignity of Moses, whereby God defends Moses over against the complaints of Moses and Aaron. So now that's what we're really interested in now, is verses 6 through 8. Now what does he say? Well, verse 6. He says, "Now hearken to my words, Shemuna Devarai, hearken to my words." The next 4 or 5 words we can translate easily. The different parts of them are plain enough, but there's something awkward about it that everyone recognizes, and different suggestions have been made to try to make a little clearer sense of it. If shall be, if shall be, Neviakim, your prophet, Yahweh. All right, so the words we all know what they mean, but what does that mean? If shall be your prophet, Yahweh. So among the suggestions for this, everyone knows what it must mean. It must be saying that if it comes to a genuine prophet of the Lord here now, how do I reveal myself to him? Well, thus and so, but then how do I reveal myself to Moses even more clearly? So here's an introduction now of the figure of the normal prophet, made like unto Moses and yet not the equal of Moses. So it says, if there shall be your prophet Yahweh. One way this has been dealt with is to say that the mem on the end of Neviakim, the letter mem, came to be written only once in the text, but it should have been written twice, and so there was originally another mem before Yahweh, a mem representing the preposition min, and so the original text, it is said, would have read, if your prophet shall be from the Lord. In other words, you're not dealing with a false prophet, you got a true prophet on your hands now. If your prophet should be from the Lord. Another way of doing practically the same thing, instead of saying that the mem should be doubled, is just to take the one mem, that's all there ever was, but to divide the thing differently, and to take that mem and to put it with the Yahweh separated from what goes before. And so instead of having kem, the plural second person suffix, you would end up with ka, the singular second person suffix. So if shall be your prophet, just ka, singular, may Yahweh, taking them in then with Yahweh from the Lord, it'd be essentially the same thing. Dr. Young, in his book, My Servants, the Prophets, which I used to assign as a sort of a text to be read in connection with this class, deals at some length with this passage. And Dr. Young just settled for, well, this is just an extremely abrupt way of saying he's a genuine prophet. If your prophet shall be Yahweh. And so that was his thought. I'd like to suggest something that tries to take account of some somewhat unusual grammatical features and yet authentic features. One of these is the dative force of suffix is not always just possessive, your prophet, but a more dative force, a prophet among you. That's one feature. And the second feature is that of the broken construct chain. You're all familiar with the fact that when you have a construct and a genitive, that nothing is supposed to come between the construct and the genitive. But on occasion, there may be something that breaks that connection, and so we call it a broken construct chain. And using both of those features, grammatical features, I suggest the translation, if the prophet, or let's put it, if there shall be a prophet of the Lord, that's the construct connection, prophet and the Lord is the genitive. If there shall be a prophet of the Lord, and then breaking the construct connection is kem, but in a dative sense, and so the full translation would be, if there shall be a prophet of the Lord among you. So, all right, here are some of the suggestions that have been made. Mine has the advantage that it doesn't involve any change in the text and handles the grammar in an acceptable way. All right, so Miriam and Aaron, don't despise Moses, because look how superior he is to prophet. If you have a situation where you just have a regular prophet, well, I reveal myself to him, but in a less direct way. Now, how is that described? In a vision, if it's just a normal prophet, in a vision, I will etwada, I will reveal myself to him. Now, here you have a hithpael of the verb yada, to know, hithpael, reveal, reflexive, myself. And the best illustration I know of that brings the force of this out is back in Genesis in the Joseph narratives. And having for a long time sort of disguised his identity so his brothers would not recognize him, the climactic point comes where he's ready to let them know, I am Joseph. And this is the verb then that is used, where he puts aside all efforts at disguise and dissimulation. And he reveals himself to his brothers. So the Lord reveals himself to the prophets, yet qualified in a vision. All right. There is privilege, there is revelation, but it's in a vision. And then further describing that is the idea halom. In a vision, in a dream. In a dream, I speak unto him. And that's privilege, as I say, but with limitations. Over against that is the higher privilege of Moses, verse 7. Lo kain avdi Moshe. Not thus Moses. Not in some secondary type visionary experience like that. Not thus my servant Moses. And then describing Moses and his peculiar dignity as alone over that whole house of God, the language that Hebrews 3 picks up when it's making this same point, that Moses stands over that whole house of God. He alone in a special way, the parallel typologically to Christ who is over the whole New Testament house. Not so with my servant Moses. In all Beiti, in all my house, in this whole covenantal kingdom order, Ne'aman, who he, and this can be taken either he is entrusted with the authority over my whole house, or it can be a subjective statement about his faithfulness. And in all of my house, he is the one who is found faithful. And therefore, in a special way, I speak to him, namely, peh el peh. Mouth to mouth, I speak with him. The next three words are a little problematic. We just had the word up above, marah, which meant in a vision. Now we get the word mareh. Now it is being denied that Moses is seeing God just marah in a vision. And yet this word mareh looks so much like it that this seems to be contradicting that, or it seems now to be saying he doesn't see him in a vision, yet he does see him in a vision. Now that would be a contradiction. And so how to handle this? E.J. Young and the treatment I referred to, and others, say that no, this is a different word, and this mareh is means plainly, clearly. Not in a vision, but plainly, and then the next two words would spell it out further, and not in riddles, not in some enigmatic, blurred way, but rather clearly. I have a little difficulty accepting that the striking similarity of mareh to marah, and we all know what it must mean, that it is not in some visionary way, it's in a clearer way, and the suggestion that I've made in some place here has to do with another feature involving the structure of a poetic line in Hebrew. Where in the parallelism there may be an ellipsis of one element, like the A element in the first part might be eliminated in the second part, or it can be the other way around. Let's see. It can be the other way around, that an element, let's say the A element in the second part, can be omitted in the first part. And so there is an element that does double duty, we say. Or on this illustration, the A feature would do double duty in the second part, even though it wasn't repeated. Or on this structure, the A element of the second part would do double duty here. And what I'm suggesting is that the negative low, which you do get in the second part of this brief poetic parallelism, should do double duty with the first. And so I would tend to like to translate this, taking this mareh as virtually the equivalent of the other marah in the vision, but with the negative doing double duty there. And so translating, mouth to mouth I speak to him, not in a vision, and not in terms of riddles. And just in the minute that we have left, or which I will work you over time here further, it concludes then by saying, and the very, it's a construct form, but the very timunah, the very form of God, the very theophanic glory of God, the very form of Yahweh he sees, mouth to mouth. Right? The very form of God he sees. And so the conclusion, why then did you not fear to speak against my servant Moses? But there at the heart of it, there is an affirmation then that Moses, and he, the paradigm for all the other prophets, is one who is caught up into the very presence of God to see the theophanic glory of God and to speak with him mouth to mouth, as a person, as it's expressed elsewhere, speaks with his friend face to face. And this is a prerequisite then for those who have the prophetic calling. The others are like unto Moses. They don't have quite that same full clarity of revelation, but nevertheless, God also reveals himself to them. So to be a true prophet, you had to have this rapturous experience whereby you are caught up and have a direct kind of revelation from the Lord. Let's see, now we meet 2 hours tomorrow. Okay, you understand? All right. As you're reading ahead, we would shortly, in your Hebrew work, please get quickly to Deuteronomy 30. It'll be a major passage that we want to deal with, and don't know that we'll get to it tomorrow are not, but we might, and so please try to be familiar with the Hebrew, Deuteronomy 30.
This is the chapter, right?